Okay.
None of you have experienced this, right? No technical difficulties with your pastoring via Zoom and live, right?
All
Okay.
right. Here we go. We're getting there.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's see. Slideshow. Okay. You got the PowerPoint now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So this is part one of three, and it's entitled Know Your Stuff. And when we were in seminary, most of us were encouraged to have solid head knowledge, and we were tested accordingly. And in a seminary like mine, you had to sit before the faculty for an hour-long blind examination, and then you sat before the board of trustees, and then your local clergy group, and in my shop that's called a classis, they get another shot at you, and it was all about your competency for ministry. And some of us were formed and shaped under that model, and we're encouraged to be competent, have a certain kind of, especially theological competence. And as you've read probably in the preface to this, to say know your stuff in a presentation like this is not about knowing that kind of stuff. It's more about knowing and understanding your story and knowing where you come from and knowing how that impacts and shapes your ministry. So uh, that's the sense of know your stuff. Some of us are map people, and some of us navigate by orienteering. So when I preach a sermon, I've got people who endlessly need stories that help them find their way through my sermon, and I've got other people like my wife who, if I don't have an outline for them, they're lost. So as a speaker, I want to honor the map people as well as those who orienteer another way. This is your map if you're one of those map people. Um, Five parts to this today, and if we get to all five, that's great. Some of this may depend on your response and your engagement with it as well. But part number one is the past is always present. We learn about how to do grief at a very early age, and that continues for us and with us for a long time. Second, I did a qualitative study, which is stories on clergy, and I've got some research conclusions about that. And then the third part is some key discoveries about pastors that I want to pass along. And fourth, if I still keep you that long, is what you really need to know and what you need to do as a pastor. And then if we have time, the fifth one is the difference between grief and mourning, and I think that's really important for us as persons and as professionals. So in between each one of these chapters or units or sections, I'm going to pause and I'm going to be open to your comments, your questions, your challenges or rebuttals if you have them. And I welcome that interaction. We're making space for that in between each one of these. And if there's nothing, then we'll just move on. And we'll still try to figure out whether or not it's best to do that by typing in a response or by speaking it. Sound good? Okay. So the past is always present. We get acquainted with grief at an early age. The next pause will take place at slide 9. I'm grateful when I was hunting for this kind of image that all of the images were found for the right side of the car, not the left side of the car, which means somebody would take this picture while driving. But we're all familiar with the notion that objects in the mirror may be larger or they may be closer than they appear. And I want to say it works that way relative to our grief and our pain. These things that are behind us somewhere may be larger than they seem. they may be sitting in our blind spot. Now, pastors need to know that we have a blind spot, and I think we need to know what's in it. And it matters whether or not it's a bicycle or a semi. It matters because we carry these things with us, and I want to suggest that I think we bring these things forward into our encounters, our experiences with church people, with board members, with stuff that happens in ministry. So for those of you who orienteer with a story, all good sermons begin with a story oftentimes. Uh, Once upon a time, I had a member of my congregation who told me the story that happened a couple days earlier of sitting at the piano, plunking along, and having her grandson, who was about 18 months, standing in between her legs, and they were both playing the piano. And she said she went to turn this way for something, and her grandson went this way. And on his way down, he hit the edge of the piano, and he cut his head, and it bled profusely. And a minute later, so the little baby boy was fine. And then her husband came home and saw her distress, and he said, as I look at that wound, as I look at that injury, it probably should be stitched up or glued up. And she had a whole nother level of sadness about that. And as she was telling me this, I was trying to be pastoral to say, you know what, I'm sure your son and daughter-in-law will still have confidence in your ability to take care of him. I'm sure they have not lost faith in you. Don't you hate it when this stuff happens on our watch? And none of this was resolving anything for her. And about 3 or 4 days later, I saw her again, and I said, I want to ask you, Sally, how's the patient? And I'm not talking about your grandson, I'm talking about you. And she was still distressed. And so in that moment, I asked her, so what is this? What's this hooking for you? What do you think this is about? And in the pregnant pause that lasted probably 30 to 45 seconds, this is one of those few moments when, as a pastor, I let the silence do the heavy lifting. She had this moment where she went, huh. And I knew that whatever was coming was going to be important. And in that moment, she said, you know what? This reminds me of when I was 5 or 6, and my brothers and I were at the local dump, and we were throwing stones at rats. And she said, "Wouldn't you know it? My brother, who's sometimes a rat, uh, popped up from behind a dirt pile, and what did he do? But he popped up right when I threw a rock, and it grazed him across the forehead, and he bled, and he had to go get stitches." And she said, "Huh, I didn't really know that I was carrying that long."
My goodness.
So what I want to say with this illustration is that grief and pain is transferable, and we carry with it. And she said, as she came to this realization about how that was operative with the encounter with her grandson, when she made the connection, she felt relief. And what she hadn't realized prior to that is she had been carrying the pain and the guilt and all of that for a long time. And it was the moment with her grandson and the realization of it that actually freed her. Now she watches her grandson with more freedom. And what I want to say for us is that stuff like this happens with us as pastors all of the time, where the situation that we're dealing with now seems heavier and seems more complicated, probably because it has roots in something deeper. So, what I want to share with you a little bit is some of my own realization of stuff. And so in my own denomination, I am a pastor to pastors, which in my shop is being a regional pastor. And when I began this 18, 19 years ago, I had all of these dreams about what we could do as local clergy together. How can we unite the churches in ministry? And how can we as pastors support one another? And the more I sat down over coffee and listened to these pastors, the more astonished I was at the pain they were carrying and the stress that they had. This is all pre-COVID, of course. Pastors who would not take vacations because they were afraid that they'd come back to a pink slip. Two pastors out of 20 or so had suicide plans that they had shared with me. Pastors who were, just on the verge of giving up. And I began to realize I have to set all of my priorities and plans and dreams aside, because what these pastors need is they need support and care more than one more thing to do and to do together. Well, simultaneously, while I was doing this as a regional pastor, my own congregation was going through epic loss. And when I say epic loss, what I mean is in about a 3.5 year period, I buried 47 people. And in that time, just a little less than half of them were under 40. So this wasn't all old people. There were car accidents, there were a couple of suicides, it seemed like every Saturday, a 65-year-old guy was dying of a heart attack. And my mental model for ministry was all tied to being a good preacher and putting all of my eggs in that basket. And what I was forced to do, that model was something I had to relinquish. But what I was forced to do in the midst of that was to accept another model of ministry that was more about pastoring. And that was really, really hard for me to do that. So that required psychotherapy. I went through a couple of years of intense treatment for PTSD because all that I had seen, I had been in one too many morgues. And following that, I did 4 units of CPE, which was as good or better than my seminary experience. And my seminary learning was phenomenal. And with that, I found myself needing or wanting to do more. Now, if you've ever met a researcher, if they're honest with you, they will tell you that research is me search. You pick a topic that is close to your heart to research, and for me, there was no question what I needed to do. And so what I did was I did a THM project in pastoral care, and I did the affect and the effect of loss on parish pastors. And so a lot of what you'll hear about today is the fruit of that. And then later on, that was in 2010. In 2016, I did a PhD project on clergy attachment style, and that was a quantitative study, which is all about numbers. And that will be this is a spoiler alert for the next session that we'll do. So what I want to start with here is that grief is a natural part of the human attachment process. And if you know anything about John Bowlby, who researched infants and their caregivers and what happens especially to the infant or the 0 to 3 year old in terms of experiencing the separation of their mother or their caregiver, what happens is a variety of different responses in that child. And what Bowlby studied was what happens when there's reunion, what happens when mom comes back into the room, what happens when a stranger comes into the room, and how does that child respond? And so, what Bowlby has scientifically put together is that the natural human process is to attach to other human beings. And we do that out of emotional need and physical distress around survival. And what happens in that encounter is that we bond. And what happens next is what's natural is there's some kind of separation. But then what happens with the grief and the distress around that? And what he says is that what we learn very early on uh, tends to follow us for a lifetime. And so what he researched was when mom comes back and has a charitable response to the infant or young child in distress, that child uh, uh, has that grief response affirmed and validated. And that develops security so that the next time mom leaves the room, that child learns that, okay, I will be able to process this distress, this grief, because I know mom will be there. And of course, this happens over months and years where this is reinforced. What happens when, suppose mom comes back in the room and her response is, and the child is always reading its parent's face. And if you have teenagers, you know that they start doing that again. You walk in the room and they can tell you exactly how your day was. But the child reads some kind of disapproval or distance. What that child does is look inwardly or turn inwardly and doesn't trust its mother or caregiver. It doesn't trust the response that it's having. It feels negative, so that even when mom comes back into the room and she has a charitable response, the child sometimes that child will pull away. Well, that's known as avoidant attachment. And if the response that a caregiver or a mother has is unpredictable, well, that child can develop anxious attachment where it's not so sure. And the research in attachment theory demonstrates that whatever these patterns are in early childhood show up in later child, they show up in adolescence, they show up in adult relationships, in romantic relationships. And the research of the last 20 years is to study how attachment style or attachment behaviors impact in the workplace, but also with leadership. So again, a spoiler alert for the next time. My PhD research study was on saying, I wonder how clergy attachment style impacts their leadership style. Again, that's next time. That's not this time. So this is a good time because I'm already filling your coffee cup with a fire hose to pause for a moment and ask and see if you have questions or comments or clarification on anything I've said.
Can I ask one question?
Please.
Um, as you're talking about all of this, um, I guess obviously it's a personal story, but when there's uh, like you're talking about those first couple of years of life, when there's a significant loss in the life of the parents, for instance, they lost a second baby, um, I'm thinking just what I've heard, back there was a time when quite often what they do with the mothers in those cases when they lose somebody is they would just sedate them, like it was a preemie and she didn't live long and stuff like that. I've always wondered, and I don't want to get into my own stuff so much as what does that mean, like with the family, and how can that play out? I'm kind of learning more as I get older about what happened, but
Great.
I don't know if you've ever done much research on that.
Great question. Not research, I guess, experience with what happens. What happens in families, yeah, especially with the loss of the child,
Hmm.
as you pastors well know, it puts the marriage relationship at great risk
Yeah.
at a level of 75 to 80% mortality rate on those marriages, and in large part because all of us grieve differently. And what I usually say with marriage partners is that we always grieve in different time zones.
Mm.
So um, uh, my wife might grieve in a California time zone,
Mm.
and I might grieve in a New York time zone, and we're living in the same space, but we are doing it very differently at a different pace and with a different weight. And as pastors, you know that when there's a loss of a child, uh, I think the number one priority for pastors needs to be about checking in with those marriage partners, but also saying, what can we do as a church for you as a couple? How the pastoral question is not just how are you dealing with the loss, but how are you dealing with the loss as a couple? Because
Mm.
that's significant. Now, to get at the heart of your question, I think is what does that do with the primary caregiver? Well, it can happen where a mother pulls away from her other children. It can happen where mom becomes excessively clingy, and and I think it's fair to say that dads could do that too.
Yeah.
But uh, we know where we come from in terms of how this has typically gone in the past, and so I think that's something to pay attention to is to say, um, why am I responding the way I am, and what is this doing to that child? Did I answer your
Yeah.
question?
Kind of. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole lot more to mine, but yeah.
Yeah.
For now,
Yeah.
thanks.
Good. Others? Okay. I'm going to keep going. I can't read what the next pause page is, but you can. Key conclusions of a qualitative research study. Remember, uh, quantitative is numbers, qualitative is stories. So this is interviews with no less than 3 dozen pastors. And what I want to give you is some central points in my THM thesis. You may know Henry Nouwen's book, The Wounded Healer, which I think in some ways kicked off some sensitivity to uh, that pastors are wounded people. I remember in my childhood, my mother reading a book called They Cry Too, and it was a book written about interviews done with, at that time, clergy wives,
Mm.
the wives of pastors, and I guess I have to ask myself, I wonder how formative that awareness was in my own upbringing and my own research. But that's a pretty unique lens. Um, but the wounded healer, I think, in some ways, at least for pastors, popularized the fact that our wounds can be a resource for others. Now, I want to say that I think Henry Nouwen, if you know his story and if you've read him thoroughly, especially the biographies about him, I'm not convinced that he ever finished his grieving process, but he came to the insight that the wounds that he felt and that he experienced could be resources for others rather than say ammunition. And there are plenty of examples of how wounded people hurt other people. Nouwen took the other approach. Um, Number one point that I make in my study is that ministry is grief work, and that's to say we need to acknowledge the ways in which emotional pain in loss in the parish and in our lives impacts how we do our work. And I'm lifting up here James Dittis's book, Recalling Ministry, that everyone should buy for the first chapter, if nothing else, where he gives the incredible insight that being a pastor is being married to someone who's not married to you. You've got a dance partner, you've got a congregation that makes all of these commitments to you, and at any given moment will revoke them, and you have to figure out how to navigate that. And Dittis also says to be a minister is to know searing abandonment daily and profoundly. So one of the pastors that I coach said to me, said, you know, Mark, what I can't believe here is how they keep banging into my pilings. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, it seems like the issues that keep bumping into me in ministry, like a boat against the pilings, are those things that have deep roots in my own story and my own soul. Well, good for him for recognizing that. And he had a therapist to help him process that. And if I don't say it 7 times during this presentation, every pastor ought to have a therapist. You need to pay someone to love you. Number 2, observe that personal wholeness for ministry comes in part by pastors engaging their griefs and losses, and our practice of loss avoidance tends to undermine our effectiveness for ministries. So to be a good pastor means you need to be a healthy person first. And so the quote that I have is from Nancy Crum there, who says, there are so many professionals out there who uh, are not able to be fully present with, as doctors and nurses in particular, uh, can't be fully present because they're too busy, uh, trying to avoid their own stuff, and they will not spend what needs to be spent on learning from their own pains and their own losses, and they squander that, which can be their best resource for knowing the terrain for the work that they need to do. So my bid is that wholeness in ministry comes when we are healthy persons first, and then healthy professionals. And I'm not going to say that my upbringing or my training, uh, push the professionalism first. But what I'm going to say is that's that's how I lived with it as a young pastor, where it was everything about the profession and the identity and all of that. And I had to learn, like many of us have to learn the hard way through experience, that that's not the best way to go. Number 3, pastors who know how to grieve their losses integrate that into their life and their work. And once they integrate that into their person, they can be an effective pastor. Ken McFadden was a consultant in my PhD research. He is the only person I have known about who writes about attachment theory and how that relates to how a congregation and a pastor can relate. It's a it's a good little book. I recommend it. And I'm just throwing these books out there because generally there's 1, 2, or 90 pastors in the crowd who love to read, and maybe you got a sabbatical, or maybe you got a vacation, and you want to dig deeper in these. These are books I recommend. Number 4, astonishingly, very little has been written or researched on the topic of clergy grief. Now that remains to be true, but in the 10 years since this original research, there are some books out there. This is one, and there's another one called Fractured and Faithful and Fractured. That's also research based. That's another good one that is starting to deal with not just clergy crisis, but clergy grief, and the stressors that are there, in part because of pre-existing conditions. And I think there's more awareness out there that we need to be aware of what we tend to bring forward. Number 5, unresolved familial and relational and ecclesiastical losses can impair a pastor's function. And I love this little book by Jaco Hamann called Becoming a Pastor, because what he does is he talks about uh, these these uh, these these practices that we ever have to be working on. And if you have a group of clergy that are looking for something to talk about or to dig deeper in, this is a great book for pastors to explore more deeply. Peter Stenke, who is a wonderful Lutheran and such a wise guy in every sense. Was a consultant for me in this project, and as we were talking on the phone one time about pastors and grief and loss, he said, "You know what? I don't know if I ever thought about this before." And again, that's a pregnant moment. He said, "You know, in my 15 years as a as a counselor to pastors," he said, "it seems to me that every client who came in the door to come see me, who were all male, of course, given the time," he said, "every one of them had lost their dad in the last 18 months." And that became the catalyst for them to say, "I need some help." And so uh, I suppose we could look at that pathologically and say, "Well, Pastor, how could you not know that you had some unresolved daddy issues?" I would much rather say, "Wow, that loss was the occasion to say, I got a lot going on. I need there's something, there's obviously something here that I need to tend to, and I need some supportive care and help and someone to help me process that." And thanks be to God that Peter's clients not only realized that, but found him as well. Number 6, reflection on clergy losses is urgently needed, but often avoided. And frequently, the literature and the discussions deal with the symptoms without addressing the causes that contribute to poor functioning. So you can find a book that says, "Never call them jerks." Well, if you are dealing with sheep that are biting in your church, it's easy to blame them. Well, maybe the question is, well, what is it about Jim or Nancy or Paul that is banging at my pilings? Why is this guy getting under my skin? What this is a pattern that I've experienced before, and I need to be well aware of that. I think Peter Scazzero does some great work. This is one of my favorites of the books that he's written, and you can find ones on emotionally healthy congregations. But it's getting at it's going at the underside of the iceberg rather than dealing with what's visible on the top. Numbers, oh, my numbering is off. That's number 7. Reflection on clergy losses. Oh, that's a repeat, isn't it? Ah, well, this is a really good book, and I don't know what the point I was trying to make with it, but this is a book on how our wounds tend to live in our bodies, and so in stressful times I go get a massage, and 20 to 25 minutes into it, I'll say to my massage therapist, "So what is my body telling you?" And she will often say, "Well, this week you're storing it in your shoulders. You know, what have you been facing?" So this is usually in your lower back. So something's different here. So when you and I have an achy knee, or we have migraines, or we got a twitchy elbow, or back pain, or neck and shoulder pain, our bodies are trying to tell us something. This is a phenomenal book. I was in a seminar not that long ago where Bessel van der Kolk was quoted. Now, I haven't heard this, but the presenter said it. The presenter said, uh, Bessel, who's a specialist in trauma, said the number one profession that deals with PTSD is train engineers. And then the presenter said, and then he said, the number 2 ones who have PTSD are pastors. Now, if that's true, that's powerful to me. And when I think of my regional pastor work, I think there's a lot of truth to it, but I think they don't know that they should be dealing with it is more accurate. Much of effective parish ministry is about engagement with disappointment and loss. Jaakko Hamann again writes this book on congregations in grief and stuck in grief, or who have experienced loss. And he gives some insights as to how pastors can help congregations walk through the grief that they don't know is holding them hostage. This book should probably be redone just for the post-COVID church, because this is where many of our churches were before the coronavirus, and we're certainly going to be there now. Last is denial is deep and difficult in many cultures, the church, and what happens in the life of caregivers, oftentimes, whether it's police or firefighters or someone who has lost who's lost a child to a miscarriage. What do people say? Well, hopefully you can have another one. Don't ever say that. People who have faced the loss of their ex-wife or their ex-husband. What happens is, because grieving is a social phenomenon, we cannot finish our grieving alone. What we need to have is have that validated and affirmed by someone else. That's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Until we have that, we can't finish our grieving process. Disenfranchised grief is about all of those places and roles that don't ever get their grief acknowledged and enfranchised. And what I want to say to all of you who are pastors is that nobody's asking you for real, how are you doing? Are you processing the tragic loss in the congregation? Are you taking care of yourself? This must be really hard on you. Some of you have people who may say that to you, and hopefully some who say it mean it. But for many of us, that doesn't happen. So when I go for my annual physical and talk to my doc, I'm one of the rare people who say to him, "So how are you feel? How are you doing? How's your health? How's your family?" And he'll say, "Nobody but you ever asked me that." Well, the same thing with pastors. We are idealized. We're looked up to. You're the caregiver. Nobody's going to be asking you, for the most part, how are you doing spiritually, or how are you holding up, and are you taking care of you? And so a lot of pastor losses and griefs are disenfranchised. They're not acknowledged, and they're not given space to be experienced and processed, because the next Sunday's coming, or there's extra services, or there's a committee, or there's a building project, or there's somebody who's out to get you, and all of that gets in the way of our own griefs being enfranchised. So what we need to do is build in some containers for our own care. And I'm going to say that your spouse, your partner, and your board can't do that for you. They certainly can't do that fully. You need to find someone or a group of someone's where you can be really honest about how difficult something is. Now it's time for our next pause. Comments or questions?
Dawn had a question in the chat. She just is thinking about churches that are preparing to close and pastors walking with them and helping them prepare for that process. And she just wonders what's helpful, what's not helpful.
That is such a good question. There's a book coming to mind right now that it's not on the tip of my tongue, that I think is really good around pastors who play a hospice role for their congregations. And I think um, I think helping the congregation, finding ways of ritualizing uh, their history, almost pulling out a soulful photo album of what have been the important challenges or the important chapters in this church's ministry. How can we love each other to death like any good hospice worker would? How can we be honest about the pain around this? And if we make spaces for for honest articulation, I think that's the best healing that we can offer. I think the word lament has been overly theologized, and sometimes it's become jargon. But Walter Brueggemann and I have been talking about this the last number of years around Walter. I love the word. I think it's really good, but it's just become sort of one of those catchphrases, and so I think what we really need is places for honest articulation. And so, what would it mean to do something like NPR does with StoryCorps, and spend 90 seconds to 4 minutes interviewing one another about what are some of your best memories, and when those are shared, some of the harder ones will come out too. Does that dig into the question a little bit?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Matt Larson's got his hand up. So
Okay.
Matt,
Yeah, thank you. I don't have an answer to Don's question, but I can say that I'm part of a group. Mark, I serve in judicatory middle management, and I'm part of a group that from around Region 3, so Minnesota and the 2 Dakotas, that is working on a block of training for pastors around, in part, congregational vitality and exploring partnerships, but also how to faithfully close. And we're trying to pull the best resources we can together on that stuff. I've been scribbling like crazy. My hand is cramping. Thank you for everything so far. You will get mentioned. But for Don and anybody else that's wondering about that, there should be a block of training coming out under the auspices of Wartburg Theological Seminary in Dubuque, and maybe through CGP2. We're trying to work that out.
So does anyone in our group know the little paperback book that I'm thinking about, when that's written about pastors who are called to bring about the closure of their congregation? No. Okay. It's 7 feet over there on another bookshelf. So maybe we'll get to a
books on closing churches, so I'm not sure.
No. Well,
I saw Matt Danielson's hand go up. Matt Danielson.
Well, this isn't so much a question, I guess, but personally, I carry a lot of anger that's based on the frustration that I have with my interaction with other pastors and the lack of connection with grief. I'll come into a situation, my heart hanging right off my sleeve, obviously hurting, and I would imagine it's a combination of, this is what I have to do all the time. I don't want to have to do it with you too. This is a safe space. And the idea that if we open up me, then we got to open up everybody, and now we got a whole messy mess. But I just have to say, I'm fairly new to this. I guess this is my 6th year as a pastor, but I am just astonished by the lack of empathy overall that pastors show to other pastors. I've found some wonderful people, but as a group, it really stuns me. Of course, then on the other hand, I'm so focused on this. Am I reaching out to other people? Am I so self-contained that I'm also not showing empathy? So I don't say that I don't carry any blame for it, but it's a real burden for me as a pastor.
mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I was just going to make the comment that pastors have a lot of scar tissue, and I think what happens sometimes is that there are some dead or dying places in pastors, and some of that is a result of not dealing with one's wounds, and so in my shops I will say, when when you're engaging your congregation, you don't share your wounds, but you can speak from your scars. So you don't bleed out over the congregation, but you end up one way or another speaking from your scars. So do you speak from uh, clean scars that are sealed up well and tight, and you can speak about what you've learned and what's happened, or are you speaking from dead tissue? And I think we're going to do one or the other, whether we realize it or not.
I have a question, Mark. In our tradition, and as I think about our seminary experience, maybe my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong. My memory is that for this kind of thing, we have the psychological test to make sure we're mentally okay to be pastors, a unit of CPE to kind of get at our own stuff so we don't project on others when we're counseling, but also good experience. I had a good CPE experience, and a lot of focus on self-care, taking your time and self-care. But do you know of any tradition or seminary system, or in your research, have you come across someone who's doing this well in training up leaders in the church right now?
Not yet.
Okay.
Did you want me to think on that longer? No. No.
It's an honest answer, right?
Yeah, it it feels to me like this is some kind of new awareness for seminaries, and uh, because many seminaries have been largely academic institutions, and I don't want to, post Reformation, we have in the Protestant tradition placed a high value on an educated clergy, and I don't want to give up on that. Having said that, um, having people with high EQ, emotional intelligence, is really important. And um, how do institutions of higher learning do that? That's a new frontier, relatively new frontier in medicine as well. So a rabbi friend and I were approached a number of years ago by a local state university to say, boy, we now for our accreditation, we need to have, we got a whole new generation of doctors who are phenomenal with gadgets, and they're going to be great on the Da Vinci surgical machine because they've been playing video games their whole life, but they're not really good with people. Now that it's become part of their accreditation, they are taking it more seriously as well. So I want to say, in the scientific and academic disciplines, this is relatively new, even though church communities, I suspect, have been crying for this for decades. We don't need Mr. Spock as our pastor. We need someone who knows their stuff, but has some relational warmth as well. And some congregations are self-aware enough to put a premium on that.
Thanks.
Yeah. Keep rolling. All right. Some key summary discovers about pastors. What I discovered as a regional pastor, and again, these are based on stories, I put them in 4 different categories. So I found pastors who were tired, who would say things like, I'm wrung out, I'm out of breath, I'm on the treadmill. All of this stuff is just more than I can take. I don't have any resources left. One pastor described it as my reservoir, and I imagined a water tower. My reservoir of the water that's going in, or the pipe of the water that's going in, is a lot smaller than what's coming out. I thought that was a phenomenal image for what was going on. And then the question is, well, what do you do with that tiredness? But this is what came out. Pastors who were uh, overdone, who were burned out, who found themselves overinvested in their church. They would talk about it as my church. They would be those who say, "Well, I need to ensure that my butt is covered whenever I say something or do something." And a good metric for when this is happening in ourselves, because I want to talk about us. I don't want to talk about other people, but a good metric for when this is happening in ourselves is we become counters. So years ago, do you know how many funerals I did this month? Do you know how many nights I've been away? Do you know how many meetings I've been to? And I started paying attention to that. What am I doing counting? And this energy in us counts butts and pews and bucks in the giving in the fund, and those are places where the business people in our churches endlessly count too. But we cannot be counting that. One of my best mentors said, never count butts or bucks. And I think that's good advice, because those things can wear you out quickly. Number three is pastors who were wounded. So you've got rogue leaders, you got snipers, you've got detractors and critics, you've got people who were on your search team that brought you to this church are now leading the posse that's trying to get you out. And pastors who are fearful about even taking a break, or I want to make sure that they see the light on in my study or my office at an early hour, so that they know that I'm working, that I can prove myself. You and I don't ever want to be working out of that energy where we somehow have to feel a need to legitimize ourselves. That doesn't mean don't be smart and don't be communicative, but it also means if that's what's motivating us, that's going to take a whole lot of energy. And then pastors who are grieving the loss of key leaders, congregational friends. There was one pastor who said, I was brought into this church by a key leader, and a month later, that person on the search committee died. People who lost key friends in the congregation, and while they are in the midst of ministry, have lost a spouse or a parent or a child. We need to pay attention to the weight of those things. Of course, we can't prevent them, but we need to know how much those things weigh. Now, I coach a pastor who's early on in his experience, and he comes from a blue collar background, so he's endlessly counting the hours that he works in a week. So he wants to be able to prove to himself and to his dad that that he puts in 40 hours a week. And I said to him, Tom, not his real name, Tom, what I think you really need to pay attention to is how much is this ministry that you're doing costing you? What is the energy expenditure? So if you're a pastor, you know that there are things that we do on a committee or a team or with a congregant that maybe it takes a half hour, but it takes 2 days worth of energy. There are people in our ministry that just suck the energy out of us, and we need to be able to know that. So there also could be a half hour encounter that gives you 2 weeks worth of energy, and to be able to start counting that, to pay attention to that, to me that's wisdom in the pastorate. And so this pastor needs to change his metric and change his model from counting hours to counting the costs and the benefits of certain kinds of engagements. So how do pastors often respond or cope? And I want to go back to attachment theory a little bit to talk about postures of defense and avoidance, and what that might look like. Pastors who are loss denying. So I think it was Matt who said, and forgive me if it wasn't, who said, I'm angered by uh, uh, the lack of empathy on some pastors. Well, maybe part of that is I am just so numb to this that I'm going to pull away. And so those pastors tend to isolate. They live with a disappointment. They don't have empathy, and they social distance before it was popular. Because, and this is not just being an introvert. This is about, you know what? I cannot. I don't want to acknowledge the weight of this, and I don't want to face this. And then there are pastors who have another response that says, you know what, I'm going to deny this in such a way that I'm going to get over it. I'm going to push over it. So, last week in my sermon, my motorcycle jumped over 6 school buses, and now next Sunday it's going to be 10. And so I'm just going to double down, and I'm going to pour myself in to my work. I'm going to hyper engage. I'm going to identify with my work, my church, my project. I'm going to do it all. I'm going to be at the center of it. I'm going to rescue people. And generally, that's coming from a posture of insecurity and anger. And again, if we're dialed into ourselves, we'll pay attention to, um, if we imagine an iceberg, I guess, again, at the top, what often presents for male pastors in particular is anger, and underneath anger there's always hurt, whether we're willing to acknowledge it or not. And that hurt is about something being trespassed in us, or it is about not measuring up, and it creates a wound. And underneath their anger, hurt, underneath that is always a need. And with ourselves, with our self-awareness, with our therapist, with our congregation, what we always want to get to is that place of need, if we're willing to drill deep enough. So the congregant that is really ticked off at me, and bombing me with emails or tapping on my sternum after the worship service. These are true examples, by the way. Um, as a pastor, I have to recognize, yep, there's this anger there, but underneath that, there's a hurt. That person is hurting somewhere, and there is an unexpressed or unaddressed need that's being masked by the anger. And so good cops have learned this too, that somebody can scream in their faces and they just let all of that stuff go past. And good therapists do that too, and find a way of saying, so what do we really need to be talking about here? And I don't think that happens without good relationship. The last category is lost despairing, and that's when pastors kind of get stuck in grief, in depression, in martyrdom. They don't know what to do. They don't have energy to get out of bed in the morning. They're disillusioned. They tend to be cynical, and all of these things, I think, have their roots in we're either trying to deal with something while suppressing the feelings, or we're only feeling it without dealing with it. And these things, in my view, again, come out of what we've learned according to our attachment style, and what we've learned about how to do grief. So when you and I go into the hospital, and I'll, speaking personally, the last time I was in the hospital with kidney stones, this very young nurse came into the room, and she said, "So how would you describe your pain level?" Well, if you've ever had kidney stones, you're at a spot where I couldn't even speak. I heard what she said, but I was off the charts. And maybe this is a metric for how we at least look at things that happen in our lives and in our parish life, to be asking ourselves, So on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the pain level of this? And of course, I'm not speaking physical pain, but what's the emotional pain of this like? And so we can have some kind of self measurement around that. My spouse and I use this all the time to say, uh, you know what? I'm really ticked off at you right now, and I want to be clear that this is really frustrating me. Uh, but on a scale of 1 to 10, it's about a 3. Now, when I speak in that tone to my wife, she hears it as, oh boy, this is a 9 or a 10. Oh, but Mark says it's a 3. Okay, I can breathe a sigh of relief. I can speak something very calmly about how frustrated or how angry I am, and she'll be thinking it's a 2 or a 3, and I'll say, "No, this is a 9 or a 10." Oh, okay, and that kind of self-talk and or talk in relationships, I think becomes a metric for describing and articulating a little bit where we are. So, some dashboard indicators that things may not be good. And again, we're not talking about other pastors, we're talking about us. So, when you start counting butts and pews, bucks, weddings, funerals, all that you're doing, that's a dashboard indicator that maybe I need to pay attention to something. Maybe I need a vacation. Maybe I need some time off. It's been important for me in my ministry, uh, and I say this because I'm not a good swimmer, um, to think about ministry as a pond. And I imagine a floating dock out in the middle of the pond. And as I'm swimming toward it, there are weeds and I get tired and whatever. But that floating dock for me is either a Sunday off, or it is continuing education, or it's vacation, or a sabbatical. And I need to have a floating dock out there to which I can exit ministry, take a breather, catch a breath, and then jump back in and re-engage. And I think all pastors need something like that. So I'm always looking to, when is my next vacation? When is my next Sunday off? When is my next continuing education time? Because I know I need a breather. And people in my life will say, yeah, you better move that dock a little closer right now because I think you're running out of steam. Number two, when we see some defensiveness, when somebody says something and we don't treat that as data, we have to respond to it. That tells us something about where we are in relationship to our rope. Again, not about introvertism, but about there's a difference between solitude and isolation. Henry Nouwen taught us that. Solitude is productive. Isolation is something else. Number four, when people are more burdened than an opportunity, there are people who are always a burden. Don't get me wrong on that. But when we generally find ourselves, when the doorbell rings or the phone rings, and our immediate response is, "Oh man, you're bothering me," another another dashboard indicator. Number five, I think a good measurement for clergy health is, are we living in gratitude? That's a good Reformed concept, a good Protestant concept of do I have gratitude and joy? Am I being driven by that, or am I being emboldened by something else? And what do I need to do to live a little more open-handedly and gratefully and enjoy? And number six, when there's not enough time and space to regroup and absorb what's truly going on. So the question is, what rafts can you put for yourself out there so that you have adequate space? So another way to say this is because I'm a regional pastor and I work with some pious pastors who are now able to forgive me, but I will start the conversation with saying, "So, what's your shadometer reading? How full's your tank?" And pastors can usually relate to that pretty quickly to say, "Oh man, it's been a week where yeah, I am 3/4 full, or I'm full." Well, I'll ask them that, what are you going to do to sort of empty the tank a little bit? What can you uh, what can you put out there for yourself in the next few days, or can I check in with you next week? And oftentimes the promise of, I'm going to check in with you again. Yeah, Mark, I knew you were going to check in, and so I've done a few things, and now it's at about a quarter full. But I think sometimes we need vocabulary to talk about what's really hard. And my hope is not to offend you with this. And if I did, my apologies. But sometimes pastors just need to be honest about how hard something is. And this is vocabulary that in my spheres often gets some traction, even if some of them won't say the word. So this is a good time to pause and hear your comments or your questions. Feel free.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
I want to circle back when you were talking about behind the anger is hurt, and you used the example of somebody pushing on your sternum on a Sunday morning. I just want to lift up that sometimes we don't need, like, we know that there's hurt underneath there, but we also need to keep ourselves safe, especially as a young woman.
Yes.
I'm always mindful about my own safety. And even if I know there's something going on with that person that's not about me, sometimes I need to disengage to keep myself physically safe. And that is okay. Even when we know there's something else, like me prioritizing my physical safety, I do not feel comfortable with people like touching me in that way. Not that you probably did, but it feels different, especially if it's an older man interacting with me in that way. It feels very unsafe. And I just want to, like, I think people know this, but like, it's okay to step away from that. You don't have to like be pastoral in that moment. You can like hide in your office or like whatever you need to do to feel safe.
Bravo on the expression of boundaries. Agreed. Yep. Laura, do you have access to whatever is in the chat?
I do.
Is there anything there we should tend to, or should we keep rolling?
Actually, yeah, there is a comment here. Just people we're pastors, we're good with words. So there's some great comments here you should read later. But
Okay.
Dane is asking, can you speak to a healthy amount of counting? I find it helpful to review the past week or month and count up the hours or evening meetings to see how balanced it felt. If it seemed too much, that's often my barometer for needing to find some R&R.
I think that is an excellent counter to the pathological expression that I gave to counting. I think it's wise to keep track of our work, but I also think to not give that counting more than it's due, and you have to figure that out. When I get to the end of the month and I report to the elders, I don't give them in my shop, those are the leaders. I don't give them names of people, but I give them sort of the case theme and how much time was spent on it, and that's important in terms of covering myself. But I don't pat myself on the back for that. I don't necessarily overly validate that. But then there are times too where I look at the list and I'll say, "Holy smokes, no wonder why I'm tired." I think that's a healthier expression of it. And what I hear from that comment is that that sounds like it's a healthy counting. It's what you do with it. Any other comments or questions, Laura, that we should?
Kent is responding to just saying he often feels that his monthly pastoral reports for council is counting what I've done in the past month in order to prove my value. I had one council that actually wanted me to keep track of hours and how I used those hours.
I think so. We're in a state of the church where we have people like that in our leadership who what I hear there is a wanting to know that pastors are not working 1 day a week. Well, that's the only time I see you, so you must have a pretty cushy job. I think there's an opportunity there for that pastor and a church leader to begin having conversations around there's more to ministry than counting calls and counting hours. That this is a job that has some special demands to it, and so how do we open up channels of communication with one another where you get what you need in terms of you have a sense of knowing what I'm doing without me having to somehow give account. And I think that takes I mean it in my current church it took a number of years for us to get to a place where that was, oh, okay. And with turnover of leadership, I'm often reminded to say, oh yeah, I got to do some of that again with the new leaders to say, this is how this goes. So I don't think this is a one and done teaching leaders and teaching congregation members what it is that goes with pastoral ministry. I think this is an ongoing curriculum that we need to enact to help them understand without falling into whininess or overwork or whatever. And I don't know that that conversation is going to happen cleanly, and it's not going to happen once. It's got to happen over time. That just feels like such a wonderful dodge to his question. Other comments or questions? All right, I'm going to keep rolling. What you need to know and do. Uh, Getting acquainted with grief. So I think you function best in ministry when you know and you have a relationship with your stuff, with your story, with whatever blessings and junk that you bring to ministry. All of it can be treasures. And I think we're naive if we don't recognize that all of us have pre-existing conditions. When I counsel a church that's looking for a pastor and they lay out, here are the things that we're looking for, I will say to them, good for you for being clear on those things. But when you find this person, I think it'd be really wise for you to entertain a conversation around all of the things that he or she uh, isn't going to be able to do and isn't going to be able to meet. And ideally, a pastor and a leadership talk about those things to say, these are my strengths, these are my weaknesses, and how are we going to accommodate them? And oftentimes, churches are so desperate to fill their pulpit, to fill their slot that they, oh, we're sure all of that stuff will be worked out and it'll be taken care of. So I think it's really wise to, as much as we can, to establish places in a pastor leadership uh, relationship dynamic to be regularly talking about those things, because there is no pastor that is going to fill the whole docket. And what generally happens is the honeymoon lasts for 1 to 3 years, and then there's a sense of buyer's remorse. Oh, and if pastors are not able to be upfront about some of the things that are our deficits or the things that we don't do well, whether that's detail or administration or whatever, uh, I think those have to be a regular part of conversation, so that there's an understanding going in. And I liken it to pre-marriage counsel. I do 4 or 5 sessions with a couple, and they're endlessly the first meeting trying to prove how in love and how solid and how forever everything will be, because no one goes into this expecting it to ever end, and expecting a divorce. And it's sobering to hear your pastor say, "Oh, by the way, every marriage comes to an end." Let's be honest about what are my goal in doing pre-marriage counseling with you is to say, what are the themes that are going to be operative for the two of you 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years down the road that you're going to need to keep working on? Well, that's usually a showstopper, but it's also a conversation starter to say, oh, so we can be honest about the things that aren't great or the things that we don't communicate well on. And I want to infuse their marriage with, no, not, now the work is really going to begin. And I think there's some learnings there for how pastors can and perhaps could function with their leadership. No one grieves the same, because no one I may have lost my mother to death, and you may have lost your mother to death, but the relationship that each of us had with our respective mothers is not the same. And so, because of that, the grief process is going to be different. So you and I may have some affinity, may have some commonality around a loss, but it's not the same. And we all know with widows and widowers in our parishes that some folks move through quickly, and many of them feel guilty about it, and others of them are just stuck. And 7, 10 years later, man, you would have thought they lost their spouse 7 or 10 hours ago. And so we need to be aware of what I'll say again is the time zones of grief. So we experience loss, we grieve, and then we can actively mourn. And what I want to say about the grieving and the mourning process is that I think they're different. Grieving is what we experience, and mourning is what we do. And so there are plenty of people in our congregations who are stuck in grief. There are pastors who are stuck in grief as well. But the challenge now is, how can we actively mourn? One of them tends to be a little passive, and the other is an active engagement with the loss, so that we can mourn it and process it. No one likes to hear this, and no one says it, but we do not manage grief. We don't. It manages us. So you may know that when you have someone up for nomination on your board, and he has just lost his son in the last 6 or 9 months, you need to do everything you can to get him off of consideration, because he is going to be occupied and preoccupied in one way or another with that, and it's not good timing for her. And so that's hard for pastors to realize. It's hard for others to accept. But grief is not something we ever manage. It manages us. It determines the time frame. And what we can do is actively engage in a mourning process in the hope that grief, I don't think the grief ever goes away, but I think that it has its place, and and we give it a container. So my image for this is probably a 10 or a 12-ounce coffee cup, and if I lose someone near and dear to me, this is going to have 16 ounces of grief in a 12-ounce cup. There will be more than I can bear. There'll be more than I can deal with. Well, when I begin to process that grief, when I begin to engage it, my container that holds this begins to expand. So soon it becomes a 48-ounce container, and then it becomes a Rubbermaid container, and then maybe it becomes a Olympic-sized swimming pool. But let me tell you that my wife or my son and that loss will never lose its significance, but my capacity to hold it uh, can change, where it is not everything, but it's in the mix, but it's not all consuming. And so I think what we want to think about is, what can I as a pastor do to enlarge my grief container? Grief disrupts, delays, and changes our identity. So if it takes one to know one. So if you've experienced the loss of a parent, if you experience that somewhere emotionally as orphaning. If you experience the loss of a spouse through divorce or death, that changes your identity. Uh, uh, 45 years ago, my mother was known as a divorcee, and she wore that as a scarlet D on her chest, because, well, that's now become your identity. If you have widows and widowers in your congregation, they'll send you two messages that seem to be running against one another. They will say, "Don't you dare call me a widow. Don't you dare call me a widower. I don't want to be one of those people." But they will also say to you over coffee, "Don't you dare ever forget her. Don't you dare ever forget him. Don't forget what has happened to me. This is part of my story. I just don't like the name." So pastors wisely hold on to both of them. Grief tends to be more of a season than a stage, and it always takes longer than we would expect or that we would desire. Our best prayers to God go in a direction of, "Please give me the strength to go through this," rather than, "Please take away the pain." When we make our prayers around, "Please take away the pain," it's kind of like saying, uh, "Man, I don't want to be so anxious." So we begin to be anxious about our anxiety. And I think our prayers around pain removal can be the same thing. I don't know if that's the right target. It's give me the strength to get through today. And I think that develops some resilience. So the pain may not go away, but your capacity to hold it may. So effective mourning is about making time or marking time more by uh, taking steps than by the calendar. So I've got a parishioner in who's got breast cancer right now, and first thing she asked her doc 3 months ago was the question of, "Well, how long is this going to take?" Well, Dr. wisely said, "Well, once you get through this, then there's this." Yeah, but am I talking 3 months or 6 months? Is this going to be a year? And the doc said, "Well, it depends on how you respond." And well, for her, that's endlessly evasive. But the anxious, understandable need is, I just need to be able to pace myself to know if I'm going to be facing this. Am I going to have a summer vacation? Am I going? Well, I don't know the answer to that. And I think for us as pastors, we need to sort of adopt some of that understanding around grief, pain, and loss, that I, I, I'm not going to be able to tell you if you're going to be done with this in 30 days or you're going to be through it, because we don't know. And so anybody who tells you is is not telling you the truth. But I'll tell you what, if you journal, and you journal once a week or you journal once a month, I'm suspecting that 6 months from now, when you read back, you will look back and you'll say, "Oh, I remember what that was like. And maybe I feel a little different, but it's still present. Oh, but when I look back, yeah, I can see that I'm a little bit farther down the road." And I think it works that way. The thing that we never learned in seminary, that I think the setting for ministry is loss. And I want to credit James Dittus for this in the book Recalling Ministry. The setting for ministry is loss. Churches are endlessly nostalgic, and by the way, nostalgia is a grief syndrome symptom. the setting for ministry is lost because you know what, we used to do this and we used to have it this way, and church like culture is endlessly changing, and so what good leadership is walking people through the loss. I want to highlight a really good book uh, called Leadership on the Line by Heifetz and Linsky. And they say in here the potent and the powerful statement that people do not fear change, they fear loss. So the people in your congregation, as soon as the next iPhone comes out or the next Android phone or whatever comes out, they're not afraid to swap phones unless they're retirees and they're still working with their iPhone 5 and don't want to change. Uh, but by and large, people are not afraid of that kind of change. But what they're afraid of is losing. And so we're living in a culture and communities, congregations that face enormous loss and enormous denial about that. And what we need to be able to do is have some of the experience and the vocabulary of that, of knowing the terrain, and then helping, companioning them as we walk them through it. And I want to go back to Yaakov Hammond's book about When Steeples Cry. That's what he's doing about grieving congregations. So what happens to us as we learn through the loss? Well, it has lots to teach us if we're willing. Your grief container will expand, and when it does, you don't have this adversarial relationship with this thing that you didn't want. You sort of befriend it. You befriend your ghosts. You befriend your pain. You embrace it. And what the fruit of that becomes empathy. So theologically, what we experience there, and again, I want to credit Henry Nouwen for this insight. What do we see in John's gospel with the disciples? But they're locked up in a room. They're anxious. They're afraid of the Jews in that text, and they're frozen and they're paralyzed. And into this locked up container comes the resurrected Christ. Has to say 3 times, "Peace be with you," because there's no peace in the room. And then what does he do? But he shows them his wounds. And the church has learned that the wounds are a source, enormous place of trauma, but they're also a place of transformation. So the medieval art that we see displays this majestic and glorious and kingly Christ who has wounds. And I think the church learns through that. It's in our brokenness, it's in our woundedness that we come to identify with others, but we also see the possibility for renewal and resurrection when we come to embrace those. And I think when I look at my own narrative and pastors who have gone through immense crisis and have processed that, the resources that develop from that become the best resources for ministry. So my bid is to love deeply and suffer well. So how can I suffer well as a pastor? That may be a scary thought for us, because going into work is stepping into the wood chipper. But how do we do that in a way that causes us to grow and can be a resource for our congregations? And of course, you shouldn't be abused and you shouldn't be maltreated in the midst of that. But stuff happens in life and ministry that is beyond our control and the control of our congregations. And the question is, how are you going to spend that pain? So clergy can become very skilled at denying and minimizing and rationalizing as a way of coping. And I want to say, when we're holding that down, when we're suppressing it or repressing it, that gets really tired for our hands. And eventually something big comes out sideways. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. Eventually we're going to get tired and it's going to come out sideways. And that comes out in things we say, in things we do, and pastors' coping mechanisms to avoid the pain or numb the pain. And so we have to recognize that pastors do not have natural people or places or relationships that support us and care for us and hear our stories of pain and hold us in gentle hands. And so I think we have to make those relationships, and we have to make those containers where we can be held. The stuff that we don't know has a power that we don't realize. It becomes the stuff in the blind spot. So my summary of self and community care advice: it's make a new mental map, pay someone to love you. That's Yaakov Hammond's stock phrase. Every pastor ought to have a therapist. Your spouse, your partner, your lay leaders cannot carry the burdens you have. Number 2, accept that you have been burdened. Accept that you have the hardest, greatest job in the world. But don't deny either. It's a hard job, and in COVID world, it's all the more hard. Spend the time you need mourning personal losses, and then let those influence your presence, your preaching, your teaching, your compassion, your way of connecting with people. Practice tenderness and soft-heartedness. When you sense yourself operating out of scar tissue, pay attention to that. Don't judge it, but just know when it's there. And open your heart to love fully and then suffer well. Time for a pause. Comments or questions?
So there was a nice couple of comments in the chat while back when you were talking about knowing us knowing our own stuff, right? And so there's a common experience of people sharing their, asking their congregations for help. Like, I'm not good at this. Help me do this. And the congregations don't know actually how to enter into that, or they're met with blank stares, or there's an attempt at help, but it's not help. Can you speak into that a little bit, like sharing those weaknesses and then how to help the congregation help you?
Yeah, good. Phenomenal question. This might be met with some frustration, but in a sense, I think the congregation can't do it. There are churches that will say, well, we need to have a pastor's support group and with constituents of the congregation. I don't think that's a good idea. My experience has been the best I can ask for is 2 support elders with whom I am very cautiously transparent. And I need to be able to pick them, and I need to be able to trust them. But I do not give them the stuff that I give my therapist. I don't give them the stuff that I give trusted clergy, because I don't think it's fair to them. I am their doctor. I am their pastor. So what I need to do is I need to be able to ask the church for, out of continuing education funds, out of when you negotiate a call, to say, this is something that I need. And it's not about selfishness, it's about self-care. And it's going to help me be a better pastor. And I don't think this is a one and done conversation. Sometimes this takes a year or 18 months for this to seep in. There's a pastor that I was coaching years ago who I was mentoring him. And when he accepted another call, he said to them, one of the things I've realized is I need therapy and I need coaching. And I've leaned on this mentor for years, and it's time I start paying him for what he's doing. And I need a therapist. So on the front end, to say, these are the things that will make me a better pastor for you, I think that's the ideal time to talk about it. Now, suppose you're already in the docket. What I think you say over time is, I need some support and some assistance that I can't look to the congregation to provide, and therefore I need your help and your assistance in making that happen. And I guarantee you that I'll be a better person and I'll be a better pastor for it. And then I think you weigh, uh, in what ways can you use some of your lay leaders or congregation members. But again, it, in a sense, it's like asking uh, uh, your doctor to change roles. And for the congregation, that's sort of how it is. You are still, the direction of care should really go one direction. That's hard to hear, but I think it's true.
Yeah, there in some of those comments there were some like some technical things like I need help. My strength isn't teaching confirmation, or like in those areas, like expressing that vulnerability to say I'm not good at this, and then maybe the congregation not quite knowing how to respond, and that might, I mean, I think everyone's got maybe their own examples of that, and maybe it's too specific for you to address to the whole group, but any thoughts just even on those technical things? I think sometimes congregations get nervous when the pastor looks at them and says, I don't know how to do this. But I think
So,
it's a
yeah,
great place to start.
it is. I think it's probably safer and less vulnerable to say, here are my strengths. Some of this is not my strong suit. So I'm going to need extra patience, or some additional help to do this well. We agree we want this done. We agree we want this done well. And I wonder how we might do that. So it's not a, I'm not doing that, or that's not my job. That does not go well ever. But to say, I'm stronger in these areas, and the longer a pastor is with a congregation, I think the more natural the congregation might say, yeah, you're not good at that. And hopefully they can say that in a loving and truthful way. But there should be places where we could safely acknowledge that that's not my strongest suit, without saying, I'm lousy at it, I'm not doing it, or I utterly, it'll be a disaster. To say, I can work on that, but just given the who I am, it's going to take lots of extra time. And it seems to me our ministry would be better suited if we could find someone that this is their primary, not their secondary gift set. I use that language all the time. Well, my primary skill set seems to be this, and my secondary, oh no, you do that well. Yeah, but it takes me a lot of energy because I'm not a detail guy. I number my PowerPoints wrong. Other comments or questions? Anything else in there, Laura, you want to hit?
Yeah, so someone is saying, what if the response is, well, that's what we pay you for?
Well, that's what the response will be. And that's why I think or that's your job. And I think, like I say, I think this is not a one and done kind of conversation. This is something that pastors love. And most of our congregations are living in a world where there are speedboats and jet skis turning on a dime. That's what businesses do. And our congregations tend to move like a freighter. And I think some of the best ministry happens when a pastor says, the best thing I can do for a congregation over 5, 10, or 15 years is do a 3 or 4 degree course correction. And and over the long term, that's going to make a big difference. I've served 2 congregations, one for 12 years, one for 15, and I regularly have to adjust my expectations around what are the realities on the ground, and how can I leaven something over time. Now, I'll give you an example. For about 7 or 8 years, I wanted our outreach director to have a different name. And I got pushed back and pushed back and nope, no, that's dumb or whatever. And finally, about 2 or 3 years ago, they came around. And now we don't have an outreach director. We have a director of community relationships. Now, that speaks a different tone in terms of we're not going to be a community that does stuff for other people, but what we want is connection and we want relationships. Now, that was really important to me, and I had to wait 8 or 10 years for that to happen. But I outlived my detractors on that. And I think there are things like that around our self care and our speaking our needs and our self-awareness that we may need to wait for the time to be ripe for that to happen. And I know that's frustrating because all of us as pastors have heard that. That's what we pay you for. That's your job. Well, it's a slow leavening process that change can happen. Keep rolling. All right. The difference between grief and mourning, I think this is really important. My clock says 15 minutes. Is that right? Till we land the plane? Okay, landing gears coming down. Hint, one is passive and the other is active. So I find the stages of grief very helpful, but sometimes they're not helpful. Any pastor knows in your congregation that all of those stages, it's a soup of stages. So one of the sermons I preached during COVID was to acknowledge that Michigan kept talking about, well, when we get to stage 5, you can go to restaurants and you can do all this stuff. And maybe it was stage 3, but everything was color coded according to stages. And I said to the congregation, you know what? We don't need to be talking about these Michigan stages. What the church needs to be talking about is the stages of grief. And the church community and the culture is in all 5 of them. All 5 of them simultaneously right now. And as a church community, we recognize that there are people who are angry all over the place because it's not normal, that there are people isolated and depressed, and there are people who, this is all a hoax and, none of this is true. And there are others who are saying, I am not stepping back into church once again until the rates are at X point and the vaccine is out and whatever. And I suspect we all know that the church communities and the larger culture is all over the map. And I wear a mask in public that says love your neighbor. And I was in a local hardware store, and there was a guy wearing a mask that said in full big loud letters, this is BS, and the BS was spelled out large. And I walked up to him and I said, I don't think our masks could be more different from one another. And he said, yeah, I think you're right. And I think we just have to acknowledge that, especially in church community. Some of us have people who are only watching through live stream. Some show up with a mask and social distancing, and some go somewhere else because they don't want to wear a mask when they sing. And as pastors, we're presiding over all of that kind of stuff. Now, I want to acknowledge that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross designed the stages of grief and did so in concert with her protege, David Kessler, who, by the way, writes great books. David Kessler is his name. He says the 6th stage of grief is finding meaning. But anyway, she wrote these stages around people embracing their own dying process. So these stages get thrown around as if this is sort of universally applicable, and we should look at them as steps along the way. And what I want to say is, well, she didn't intend for these to be sequential phases. What she intended is themes around one's own grieving one's own death. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be applied elsewhere, but I think we know plenty of people who are, oh, yep, I'm in the bargaining stage. And then a month later, they're wondering why they're angry. And well, it's not neat and clean like we sometimes try and make Elizabeth Kubler-Ross out to be. So grief is the experience, but mourning is the active work that we do. It's the task that needs to be entered. And so William Worden lifts these up that says what we have to do is accept the reality of the loss. So when someone who's been a lifetime member of your congregation decides that they want to go to Second Lutheran Church down the road because that church has better parking, what you need to do is know for yourself how much this weighs for you. Maybe this was friends of yours. Maybe this is people who served valiantly with you, and you have to know how much that pain weighs. And if it's a relational loss of, through death or an accident or trauma or what, you have to weigh that too. Number two is process the emotional pain that goes with that, and that to me is what really happens with a therapist. When I was going through my trauma therapy, it was amazing to me how just speaking my truth to my trusted therapist, it didn't have to make sense, it didn't have to be orderly, it just came out of me. It's amazing to me how that just processing that in a safe place allowed me to go down the 11 floors on the elevator, and I walked out onto the sidewalk in the downtown area, and the sky seemed a different color. It was a little bit weight off of my shoulders, and I think we need places where we can do that. Number three is to adjust to a different world. No one signs up when we get married for divorce. No one signs up for an early death. No one signs up for cancer. No one signs up for all of that. But what we have to face is that we ought to be experts at transitions. Transitions is a fancy word for processing losses. That yellow Heifetz and Linsky book that I highlighted said the leader's first task is to help people process the transition or process the loss. And unless we do that, everything is going to be dancing around that. No one has asked yet, or maybe it's in the comments, but anytime I teach, anytime I do something, there's this guy here named Tusk, and he's in my study, and he's here, and he's in my classroom, and he just sits there because there's always an elephant in the room. And astute students, after a week or two, will say, just a quick question, what's with the elephant? And that's when I stop everything and I say, it's been here for a long time. It's always been here. But thank you for naming the elephant. We all have elephants in the room, and the way we tame them is by naming them. And so when I'm with someone in my study, that's where I am now, this elephant hangs over the edge of a room divider, and once in a while people will ask, and I will acknowledge that we all have an elephant in the room, and by naming it, it makes it smaller. Number four is to find an enduring connection with the loss or the lost while trying to make a new life. So I commend my widower who keeps a picture of his wife by his bedside, and he blows her a kiss every night. The relationship with Mary had changed 7 years ago when she died of cancer, but he still has an enduring relationship with her. When he thinks of her, he doesn't shed tears anymore, other than hoping for a reunion with her, having a daily connection with her. But it's learning to have a new relationship that's not driven so much by the grief, but by by something new. I think new President Biden said that at a funeral one time to someone who had lost someone in a shooting, if I'm remembering correctly. He said, I promise you from the voice of experience that there will come a time when you remember them, and it will not be with tears, but it will be with a smile. Then you will know that you have walked through the grief, and you've mourned them, and you've mourned them well. You're not done, but you're through it. So factors that will influence the work and the duration of this. So what was the person? What was the relationship? What was the nature of the connection, the attachment with that person? How that person died? Was it complicated? Was it traumatic? Was it ambiguous? Did this come in the face of multiple losses? Again, just speaking my own narrative, I had a February 20 years ago where I did, I want to say it was 8 or 9 funerals in a 5-week period. And one of them, one of the Saturdays I did 2. And, that accumulated grief and loss where you can't process that takes on a whole new weightiness, even if these were, 95-year-olds who have been long ready to go see Jesus. That loss is not insignificant. Your personality style, social variables like was this a strong support person? Does this happen while you're raising an unruly teenager and your dog is in hospice care, your dog of 12 or 14 years? Well, yeah, it's just a dog, but for you dog lovers and dog owners, this is a member of the family. Well, yeah, it's just a dog, but it's more than a dog. And to know that that's going on for yourself. So things that we must say, ministry is grief work. Churches operate in a culture of loss. That's certainly going on right now in a COVID work. The work of pastors is impossible to do well. And it's one that we're going to experience injury around, and we need help with that so that we don't deny and repress the pain. Oftentimes we don't know what we don't know. So if we don't know something, we need someone else's help to see it. And if we don't know about it, it's going to hold us hostage. And some of the hardest parts of grief and loss really need expression. And when they happen, they can be tools for our toolbox. So this is the final couple of minutes for comments, questions, and rebuttals. Again, of course, you name it, your time.
There's a question about ambiguous loss. What do you have to say about ambiguous loss?
Is there more detail on that question, or is the question, what is that?
He says he's wondered about the way a pastor grieves and mourns, and then he says what Pauline Boss has coined ambiguous loss.
Yeah, well, ambiguous loss is the kind of loss that we cannot put our finger on. When illustrations that we would all be able to not necessarily personally relate to, but understand the situations when a person is lost and their body is never found. It's amazing to me how important after a loss with a fire or a really dramatic car accident or a drowning victim, when those ashes come or those remains are finally found after days or sometimes months, the period in between there is filled with distressing ambiguity. So is she really gone? Maybe there's maybe I can hold out some hope. Those are ministry illustrations that I think are tractionable, but there are certainly others. When the circumstances around what really happened here are playing, that is particularly difficult. Suicide and what leads up to it is another spot. And for the, this is safer illustration. I think where the church is right now around how to process the new COVID reality that we are in is a fine example of, so is the world we once knew ever going to come back? Researchers will say, this is a dress rehearsal for the big one that hasn't come yet. There's a lot of ambiguity around where we are right now.
Yeah, Andrea's just said in the chat, the lack of public funerals this year has created a sense of this ambiguous loss for our congregation. Loss of key volunteers has not been faced.
That's the best example so far. That's better than all of mine. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that, Andrea. I'll just make a comment about the next session will be, so just imagine just a little bit that we've talked about attachment, bonding and grieving, and when that cycle is interrupted, imagine if someone did a research study on pastors and their attachment style and their grief experience, and imagine what that would look like in terms of how that impacts their effectiveness and their longevity in their congregation. That's the teaser for what we're going to do next time, because somebody did that.
And that next time is Thursday, February 25th, right back here. I want to say that if there has been a book, and you have mentioned so many, are you going to have a bibliography or a resource list of some kind, Mark?
What if I send you my PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah.
And you send that to participants, and then they've got it. Because I've got a raft of favorite quotes that we didn't get to that are part of the.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll get this PowerPoint from Mark, and anything else, and the recording of this will go on the CGP website. There's a resources page, and on the resources page, there is a grief and loss tab. So that's where you'll be able to find all the resources for this. But what I want you to do, everybody that's participating in this, is find the book that you want and email me the title, and then CGP will send you that book. I thought, when you mentioned the first three, I was like, oh, we'll just pick from one of those three. And then I was like, I got to stop writing down titles of books. So you guys, you sift through, you find the one that you really want, and then Continuous Growth Pathway will send it to you in the mail. So just email me that.
You gotta this is part of a Lilly grant, right?
Yeah.
You gotta love the Churches One Foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Good old Lily. We are grateful.
Aunt Lily is wonderful. So Laura, when I send you the PowerPoints, I will look up the title of that book that I can't remember on pastors who are pastoring churches that are in the closing process, and then you can do whatever you want with that one as well.
Great.
And I'd encourage this group to share best resources with one another somehow, if that's doable, because we need each other.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, and we have got a Facebook group, and then also on the website where this event is. So on this event, and then the next one in a couple of weeks, there's a comment feature that's enabled on the website, so you could also leave comments with resources there. So well, I want to say thank you to Mark. Thank you to everyone for coming, and we'll see everybody at part 2.
Thank you all.
Be compassionate with yourself in this time. Know yourself, but know yourself with some gentleness, because it's harder than ever to do your important work. So thanks for what you do.
And Mark, if you want to stop the recording, I'm going to fix that for next time. That shouldn't be your responsibility. Sorry about that.
And I get to be the gatekeeper